This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and well, look who's back. It's Matt Lewis. Welcome.
Can't get rid of me now, can you? I'm sorry.
You're like a bad rash, right?
Yeah, keep taking the antibiotics and I might go away.
Well, we have to finish the story where we left off last week because last week we talked about Matilda and Stephen. Basically, the focus was Matilda, but there was a lot of Stephen too. And it helped us really understand what was going on at the time. Stephen wasn't really the bad guy that we think he was. That was probably the biggest takeaway for me in that episode. So bravo to you on that.
Yeah, thank you.
So this episode, we kind of leave off from that, but I'm going to paint the little picture because in the last episode, I think you said that Stephen agreed to make Henry his heir. He adopted him, so to speak. I don't know if that was like a legal adoption. And Empress Matilda died. So that's kind of where we left off there. Where I would love to start in this episode is before Stephen dies. Kind of seeing what it looked like then. And I want to understand Henry's choice of a marriage partner and how that all played out, essentially.
Yes. So, I mean, Henry at this point is, he's still a very young guy. He's born in 1133 in Le Mans in his father's county of Anjou. Destined to be the next Count of Anjou. Not a bad title, but this is a guy who will accrue so much land and power and so many titles. And he's also, Henry, I think, I say this a lot, I think he's probably the most impressive person ever to sit on the throne of England and Britain. I think he's the greatest king monarch that England or Britain has ever had. He's a really strikingly impressive man. So when he invades Stephen's England in 1153, he's a 20-year-old guy. This is pretty impressive. He's already by this point Duke of Normandy because his father, I think we talked about last time, while Matilda is busy trying to capture England, Geoffrey is chewing up chunks of Normandy. He takes it very, very slowly. It's quite a slow process. He can't just wander in there and take it over. But he works his way at it for years and years and years. And almost immediately after taking Normandy, he hands the dukedom over to his teenage son at that point. So that's in 1150, a few years before he invades England. So he's 17 at that point, and he's made Duke of Normandy. And there's a family precedent for this. Geoffrey became Count of Anjou when he was 16. His dad, Fulk, got a very nice invitation to go over to the Holy Land and marry Melisande, the Queen of Jerusalem, and become King of Jerusalem. And he was like, thank you very much. I'm off. 16-year-old Geoffrey, you're in charge. You're the man of the house now. So there's kind of a precedent for this happening. And clearly Geoffrey felt that Henry was up to the task of doing this, despite Henry's botched invasion of England a few years earlier at 14. Clearly the last few years he's been doing quite well. He's been doing as he was told, and he's allowed his Xbox back now. He can go to the Duke of Normandy. So Henry is then hit by this kind of series. He wants to now invade England. He wants to go and challenge Stephen. But every time he's preparing for it, he's hit by a little disaster. They're not all disasters, we'll get to. But the first time he tries to muster forces to invade England, he gets news that his dad has died. So he has to go back to Anjou and settle things there. Misses out on a lot of the campaigning season. The next time that he tries to invade, there's a revolt back in Anjou again that he has to go and settle before he can sail. The third time he tries to invade is when it's not a disaster. So this comes just a few weeks after Eleanor has been separated, had her marriage annulled from Louis the Seventh of France. Get my Louis mixed up. And she's back on the marriage market. Eleanor has a huge problem. So her marriage is annulled. She has two daughters with Louis. So all of the scandal that has surrounded Eleanor that's been used as reasons for the end of that marriage. The real reason is that she hasn't given Louis a son. They've got 2 daughters, but no son, which obviously can't be Louis's problem, can it?
No, obviously not.
Got to be Eleanor's fault. Yeah.
Right.
So their marriage is annulled on the grounds that they're too closely related, that old consanguinity thing that everybody falls back on. So you're exactly the same, related in exactly the same ways as you were when you got married, and you knew that.
Yeah.
But okay. So Eleanor, I mean, I think pretty tragically, horribly for Eleanor, she's forced to leave her 2 daughters behind in Paris. They are royal princesses. They kind of have to stay with the king, their father. Eleanor has to go back to Aquitaine. She's still Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. Louis does his best to hang on to that title, but he can't make it stick legally. And so Eleanor heads back to Aquitaine to pick up ruling there. She has to leave her 2 young daughters with Louis behind. And despite lots of later stories about Eleanor that I'm sure we'll get onto later, she never ever sees those 2 daughters again for the rest of her life. You know, she leaves them in 1153 when they're, what are they, kind of 8 and 3.
Oh, wow.
Never sees them again for the rest of their lives.
Can't even imagine that.
Yeah, no. They go on to have, you know, spectacular marriages. Their dad makes really good marriages for them to his allies in France. Their family are incredibly important, but Eleanor never gets to see them again. On the way back to Aquitaine, there are 2 recorded attempts to kidnap and forcibly marry Eleanor. So the first comes from Theobald V, the Count of Blois. Eleanor manages to avoid that, and then she gets word that Geoffrey of Anjou, who is actually Henry's little brother, is also waiting to try and kidnap her. So she kind of takes a long route around where Geoffrey's laying in wait and manages to avoid him. But what this really does for Eleanor is drive home the fact that, you know, she is now an incredibly valuable heiress on the marriage market again.
Yeah.
She wants to keep her control of Aquitaine. She absolutely wants to keep that. How does she do that is the question. You know, if she's going to be targeted by men who are trying to force themselves on her, it probably drove home that she's probably going to have to get a husband. You know, as much as someone like Eleanor must have hated the idea that she has to have a man.
Yeah.
I think she's pragmatic enough to realize that in the world she lives in, she probably does have to have a man. And I think what she does is she takes control of the situation, which is what you would expect from Eleanor of Aquitaine. This is exactly who she is. She takes control of it. She says, if I've got to have a husband, it's going to be a husband I choose. It's not going to be a husband who's kidnapped me and forced me to marry them so they can have my dukedom. And I think you can imagine her getting back to Poitiers in Aquitaine and kind of sitting there and trying to work out, you know, who's available. Who is there around that I could marry who is powerful enough to protect Aquitaine? Now, Eleanor, I think for Eleanor, for her entire life, her only primary overriding concern was the future of Aquitaine. That's what she's really worried about protecting. Yeah, so I think, you know, Eleanor takes control of the situation and she thinks, if I'm going to get married, I'm going to choose who it is. Mm-hmm. And as she's looking around thinking, who can it be? It needs to be someone who can protect Aquitaine for her. It needs to be someone who can stand up to Louis, who has made it pretty clear that he's going to try and retain his control of Aquitaine that he had by right of being married to Elizabeth. He's trying to make a legal case that he should have Aquitaine on behalf of their daughters. And I think Eleanor has to keep saying, but I'm not dead. No minor detail.
I'm still here.
Still here. Yeah. So it's got to be someone powerful enough to do all of those things. And someone who's not married.
Ideally, yeah.
Someone with prospects, perhaps. And it can't have taken her long to reach Henry. You know, he's now Count of Anjou as well as Duke of Normandy. So controls a huge chunk of northern and western France. She controls southwestern France. You know, I say France, what we call France today. So places like Aquitaine, in particular, Burgundy, Brittany, still consider themselves very much independent from Paris. So they controlled a huge chunk of land together. And I think both the idea of what she was doing and the mistake in what she was doing was setting herself and Henry up as a direct threat to Louis, because they control so much of that territory if they get married they've got to appear to be a threat to Louis. Louis is a king without a son still at this point. What he doesn't need is this young upstart who now controls everything to his north and west and is starting to wrap around to the south as well. That's a pretty scary thought for, an aging king who doesn't have a son. Henry is like 9 years younger than Eleanor, and is setting his sights on England next. So can you imagine if this guy who controls huge chunks of France already, if he marries Eleanor, is going to control even more and has the prospect that one day he might be king of England?
Yeah.
That's terrifying. And I think that's part of the point of what Eleanor is trying to do when she thinks of Henry. But in the longer term, it's the thing that causes her family and England and France for generations, no end of problems, as the Capetian and the English kings, Plantagenet kings, end up at loggerheads for generations. But sitting in Poitiers, Eleanor thinks Henry is my best option in this circumstance. So Henry, again, is on the north coast mustering it, and he's there with his armies and his ships. He's like, right, lads, this time nothing is going to stop us. We're going over to England. We're not calling it off this time. And then he gets this letter from Eleanor of Aquitaine saying, hi, Henry, fancy coming and marrying me? She makes the offer. And I imagine Henry is very much like the cartoon dog on the slippery floor. His legs are moving so fast he can't run as quick as he wants to get down to Aquitaine, because he abandons that invasion of England again, shoots down to Aquitaine and marries Eleanor almost immediately. And this causes complete outrage in Paris. So Louis is busy trying to find himself a new wife, but heaven forbid the wife that he's chucked away should find herself a new husband. Louis has, a little bit of a leg to stand on here, in that both Henry and Eleanor are technically his vassals. They owe him fealty and allegiance. And as very, very senior figures in his kingdom, he would expect to have some right of consultation in both of their marriages, let alone their marriage to each other, let alone marrying his ex-wife Eleanor a few weeks after they've had their marriage annulled. And I think Louis instantly sees, this is such a dangerous alliance that he is completely outraged and immediately put on alert by all of this. I think Henry at this point, 20 years old, young enough to really not care. He's just married himself a nice older woman who comes with a whole massive territory of land that he's had to do nothing, no fighting to win it. Yeah. He's just kind of doubled his holdings in the moment that he said, I do.
Mm-hmm. It landed in his lap.
Absolutely. So he's now Count of Anjou. You can chuck in Maine as well, the other county that's sort of part of Anjou at this period. Duke of Normandy. Now he's Duke of Aquitaine in right of his wife. And he manages to actually head back to that planned invasion. He hasn't sent everybody home this time. Rushes down and gets married, says, hi, Eleanor, bye, Eleanor, and goes off and invades England. And this is where, this is the moment where we had that invasion of England when we spoke last time. He gets into Stephen's England. They sort of, he tears around the countryside a little bit, causes a bit of trouble. Stephen and Henry continually don't fight each other. They end up standing, I think, as I said, standing either side of rivers all the time going, oh, if this river wasn't here, I'd really beat you up. Don't worry about the bridge over there. Ignore that. The river's in the way. They're actively not fighting each other. And so, we get this situation where Stephen's son, Eustace, gets utterly outraged by his father's refusal to fight Henry off, tears off into East Anglia, causes a whole load of trouble and kerfuffle, and then unexpectedly dies. Stephen's other son, William, kind of says, I do not want to be king.
Right.
I don't want what you've just had, Dad. I don't want any part of that. He's happy to just live a comfortable life as a very, very wealthy nobleman. And so we get this agreement in which Stephen effectively legally adopts Henry as his son and appoints him as his heir, so that Stephen is able to say, dynastically, my adopted son is still following me onto the throne. My biological son doesn't want to be king. My adopted son will come after me. There's sort of a little bit of dynastic salvage in there. And it solves the problem of this 19-year ongoing battle about whether it's Stephen or Matilda who should have ruled England, because now we've got Matilda's son and Stephen's adopted son is going to be the next heir, and everybody can come together and get behind Henry, and there kind of isn't any kind of a rival. So all of that is sorted out towards the end of 1153. They make these legal agreements, proclaim all of this everywhere. And Henry quite bravely, trustingly, I don't know, goes back over to the continent. And he very clearly thinks, I'm just going to get out of Stephen's way. Maybe he's thinking, if I stay here, how does this work? It's going to cause friction. It's going to cause problems that we don't need. So he gets out of the way. And he could have left space there for Stephen to plot against him, but Stephen doesn't. But by the end of, in October 1154, Stephen dies. And Henry takes his time to come over, which is a big move. You think about how his grandfather, Henry I had become king, snatching the throne, leaving his brother's body cold, dead and going cold on the forest floor so that he can go and get crowned.
Yeah.
Matilda had been denied her inheritance because Stephen had done exactly the same thing. But Henry waits like 2 months before he comes over to England. And it's not until the 19th of December, 1154, that both he and Eleanor together, they arrive together and they have a coronation together in Westminster Abbey. So it's quite brave, but it's possibly also a bit of a challenge to say, do you know what? If you want to stand against me, go for it. Let's see what you've got. Because if nobody challenges him at this point, nobody uses this interregnum that still exists to try and jump in and get themselves crowned, nobody can claim afterwards to be the rightful king against him.
Yeah.
I don't know whether he's leaving space to see, let his enemies make a move if they're going to, but nobody does. And I wouldn't against Henry either. This is a guy who, when he becomes king, is now controlling an absolutely vast swathe of territories. He's got bigger territories than has been seen in Western Europe for hundreds and hundreds of years, since Charlemagne's empire, really.
Wow. So he came to the throne more in a peaceful transition than maybe his uncle did.
I think so. In the first time in generations, William the Conqueror's son, William II, follows him onto the throne fairly peacefully, although he fights with his brothers for the rest of his life. Mm. But, Henry had snatched the throne when he wasn't meant to be the next king. And then Stephen has snatched the throne when he wasn't meant to be the next king. And Henry has kind of managed to have a smooth, accepted succession. Nobody challenges him. He inherits quite a lucky situation in that when we spoke last time, we talked about King David in Scotland, who had pushed his borders south. He'd used the fact that Stephen and Matilda were distracting each other in the south to push into England. David dies just before Stephen as well, and Scotland has a small child on the throne. So Henry takes an army north and he goes, I'll just take this back from you if that's okay. Anyone want to fight me for it? No one wants to fight me for it? Right, this is England again. And he just puts the border back where it had been before. But it's not because he's particularly brilliant. He doesn't go about winning battles or anything like that. It's just the luck of the fact that Scotland is not in a position to fight him at that point. And so he manages to get England back together, if you like, back on an even keel really, really quickly. And that obviously makes him look incredibly impressive. It's maybe not quite as impressive as it looks, but I do think Henry's an impressive guy. So yes, he's managed to make this peaceful succession for the first time in a very, very long time. And I think people felt like that boded well for the future. They're quite hopeful at the beginning of Henry's reign. If the Civil War is over, if there's not going to be any more fighting, England is back, looking the same as it did in Henry I's day, and now Henry I's grandson is on the throne of England. Fingers crossed.
Yeah. It makes me wonder how different things would have been had he not married Eleanor at that time. Would he have been seen as powerful as he was without her by his side?
Quite possibly not. Aquitaine is a massive, if you listeners want to go and find a map of medieval France, Aquitaine is huge. Mm. It's almost half of what we call France at this time, maybe not quite that much, but it's vast. And if you add to that all of the other territories that he's got, he's a huge threat. And Louis doesn't seem, I think the striking thing is that Louis is not too worried about Henry. We don't see any signs of alarm around Henry when he's Count of Anjou and he becomes Duke of Normandy. It's only when he acquires Aquitaine as well and is married to Eleanor that I think you see Louis starting to think, not having this. This is a problem. I need to sort this out. So I think if he hadn't had Eleanor at his side, he might have struggled a little bit more. But I think Henry would probably have taken England without Eleanor. She's not too involved in that. But it does mean that he's coming to England as an even more impressive young man, 20-year-old man, than he would have come to England as anyway. I think he would still have been impressive. I don't necessarily think being married to Eleanor changes the course of his conflict with Stephen. But it means, he can arrive as well and get crowned with a wife. And hopefully that promises a nice settled future, because I mean the part of the reason that Louis must have been absolutely fuming when this marriage happened as well is that by August 1153, so before the coronation, less than a year after they're married, Eleanor gives birth to a boy.
Wow.
Which is exactly what Louis had said she can't do. She can't provide me with a son. That's why I can't have her as a wife. It's her fault. It's not me. It's her. And almost 9 months after she marries Henry, here she is with a son. And what does she have a couple of years later? She has another son. And they keep producing children at a rate that is frankly embarrassing for Louis, while he's still desperately trying to have a son. It takes him another 2 marriages before he manages to have a son. And all of the time, dynastically, Henry and Eleanor are beginning to look so much more terrifying to Louis.
Wow, I love the stories. It's like Henry VIII, right? Blaming his wives for not having a son, and Louis over there going, well, this is interesting. It makes me wonder, like, what was going on in his head at the time. Like, okay, maybe it was me. He probably wasn't thinking that, was he?
I mean, he can't say that out loud, even if he does. But this is kind of injury on top of insult, isn't it? It's bad enough that they've gone and got married, but they've gone and got married without his permission. They've become a huge political threat to him, and now she's personally embarrassed him by going and having sons with this man when she hadn't been able to give him a son in 16 years of marriage together.
Wow. It's quite
he must have just been absolutely fuming, and in private he must have been thinking, maybe I am the problem, but nobody needs to know that.
Right. I'm not gonna put out a newsletter and tell everybody this is the case. I'm very interested in what their court was like, because I don't think this is something that you and I have talked about before. What was the court of Henry and Eleanor like?
It's interesting. So there are lots. The first thing to say, I guess, is there are lots of myths, particularly about Eleanor's court. We get stories of her holding these, courts of chivalry, and that she's overseeing deliberations about who is the greatest knight and who has the most romantic story, and who loves their lady more than anybody else, and all of those kinds of things. And all of that is complete nonsense. All of that is made up later, unfortunately, for anyone who loves it. Not least because, again, very sadly, all of those stories paint her as holding those courts with her daughters, Marie and Alice, her daughters with Louis, who we know she never ever sees again.
Oh, okay.
So she is not spending time with her 2 daughters by Louis, overseeing these, romantic courts of chivalry. But Eleanor does come from a place, the south of France is almost considered a different country culturally from the north of France. Okay. So one of the things that must have been really jarring for Eleanor when she went to Paris was she's raised in the south, which, warmer temperatures, a much more liberal, relaxed atmosphere. Her grandfather, William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, is widely called the first troubadour. It played a key part in inventing this troubadour tradition of singing songs. And some of those songs were about love and romance. Some of them were political diatribes. Some troubadour songs in Aquitaine around this time are very much about how terrible the King of France is and all of that kind of thing. William IX was particularly good at rude things. This is the guy who knows all those rude limericks that can just reel them off. He writes so many songs about sex and everything else that, this is the atmosphere Eleanor is growing up in. Her granddad passes away when she's only very little, but he has cultivated this culture in his court of freedom and openness, and poetry is encouraged. Imagine sitting in the grapevine fields of the south of France, listening to poetry and occasional rude song as well. When Eleanor goes to Paris, Paris is, by comparison, such a monochrome place. It must have felt so dull to her. It's such a serious, austere place, so alien to what she's used to in Aquitaine. And I think there can't be any doubt that she would have wanted to take some of that happiness from Aquitaine to Henry's court. I mean, you think Richard, their son, Richard the Lionheart, is famous for writing poetry and songs and all of those kinds of things, and becomes a hero of ballads because he's also part of that Aquitanian tradition of troubadours and of poetry and of singing and of songwriting and patronizing all of those things. So I think she has a definite interest in all of those things. Henry is really funny on this front because there are kind of two sides to him. So Henry is an incredibly intelligent man. All of the writers who write about him will tell you he's this really bullish figure, bit of a lad, but actually incredibly intelligent. They say that he can converse with people in every language from Portugal to the Bosphorus. Almost any European language he can understand. They don't say he can speak it fluently, but if an ambassador comes from somewhere, he knows enough to understand what they're saying. They say, he's fluent in English, French, Latin, and a couple of other languages and stuff like that as well, properly fluent in all of those things. Politically and militarily, Henry is a bit of a genius, I think. He's really, really gifted. So their court must have been a place where books and learning and enjoying culture was encouraged. We get writers like Walter Map and things like that. These are guys who are at Henry's court, and they write these great long accounts of how wonderful it is, and they also gossip loads. It's almost like they're trying to be William the Ninth and be a little bit bawdy and everything else, but they're trying to do it in a very English way. This is stiff upper lip rudeness. They can't quite bring themselves to be as bawdy as the Aquitanians, but I think you can see that influence in some of the writing that's going on at the time. But the other side of what Henry's doing is that Henry absolutely despises the pageantry of court life. Oh. He has no time for being a king. He just cannot be bothered. So Easter 1158, for example, so 3.5 years into their reign, him and Eleanor celebrate Easter at Worcester Cathedral. And the Norman kings at this point have a tradition of wearing crowns, particularly at feasts, so Christmas and Easter and major moments like that. They'll wear their crowns and they'll process. Easter 1158, you get this scene at Worcester Cathedral where Henry and Eleanor visiting the city for Easter, huge honour for the cathedral. They process through Worcester Cathedral wearing their crowns. Henry gets to the altar and he takes it off and he puts it on the altar and he was like, I'm not doing that again. And to the best of our knowledge, Henry never puts a crown on his head for the rest of his life.
Wow, I've never heard that.
Just can't be bothered. Part of the reason that Thomas Becket becomes so hugely successful at Henry's court is that he will do all the work. So think Henry VIII with Thomas Cromwell in his early reign.
Yeah.
Henry II can't be bothered, not with the business. He's happy to do the business of ruling, but he can't be bothered with the pomp and the circumstance and the show. So he gets Thomas Becket, who is happy to do all of that stuff. Thomas Becket wears the finest clothes, throws the most lavish feast you can possibly imagine, because Henry doesn't want to. There are some stories that talk about, Becket throwing feasts on the king's behalf, feasting the whole court, immaculate laid tables and all the great and the good of the kingdom around the tables in Thomas Becket's hall. And Henry will just ruck up and ride his horse into Thomas's hall from the hunt, covered in mud, in his riding clothes, hop down from the horse, jump over the table, sit back in his seat, feet up, and start eating food. And they almost describe Thomas Becket sitting next to him going, "Oh, what are you doing? You're making me do all this for you, and then you're ruining it anyway." So you get a picture of Henry as someone who is absolutely not interested in that magnificent. I mean, he's such a magnificent character. You think of the territories that this guy runs, and he's like, I will do all of the work. He rides the length and breadth of Europe, Western Europe, his territories, for the whole of his reign. He's darting around from the north of England to the south of France and back again all of the time. He lays siege to castles so successfully that he reaches a point. Nobody quite seems to understand why Henry is so successful at besieging castles. But if anyone rebels against him, and they pull up the drawbridge on the castle and they're like, ha, you can't get us, Henry turns up and gets into that castle in a matter of days. And it reaches the point where everyone is like, we don't know how he does this. But if he turns up at castles from a few years into his reign, people are just like, okay, it's yours. I'm not even going to try. He becomes so good that he doesn't have to do it anymore because the threat that he might do it is enough for everybody. So he's devastatingly effective, but utterly disinterested in magnificence and pomp and display. And I can't help wondering whether that irritates Eleanor a little bit, because I think she would like all of that kind of stuff, at least the culture. And Henry is such an intelligent bloke who is interested in books. He reads and he learns languages and stuff like that, but also won't show anybody how magnificent he is at all of those things. To the point where, another story, but Thomas Becket is sent to France to arrange a marriage between Henry and Eleanor's oldest son. So their firstborn son actually passes away, sadly, in infancy. Their second son, Henry the Young King, as he's known, they want to arrange a marriage between him and one of Louis's children from a different marriage, not one of his daughters from Eleanor's place. It's weird, but it's not that weird.
Yeah, right.
Henry wants to arrange this marriage, and he says, you know what? There is no way I'm processing my way into Paris. What an absolute bore. Thomas, you can go and do that for me. And you get these accounts from chroniclers in Paris who are watching Thomas's arrival, and Thomas turns up with half a mile long stream of wagons that are laden with barrels of wine and plate and gold and silver. And they talk about, every horse that's pulling a carriage has a monkey sitting on its back and a mastiff tied to its reins walking alongside it. And it's just, it's ridiculously more and more impressive. And after that come all of these knights, and every knight is on his war horse with a squire walking in front of him, and they're all wearing their full armour processing into Paris. And then there are cartloads of the young nobles of England who are in Thomas's care, in his household as chancellor, kind of, proclaiming, these are the people that I look after and that I'm teaching. And then there's cartloads of books and, all of this kind of stuff. And then last of all, Thomas arrives, full of splendor. He's the climax of this entire procession. And all of this because Henry can't be bothered. And all of the chroniclers record all of this, and they record how utterly impressed they are. And they say at the end of the account of it, if this is the King of England's chancellor, imagine how splendid he must be. And it's like, oh, if only you knew. If only he's not, and he doesn't want to be, and that's why Thomas is here. But it kind of has the opposite effect to what you might have expected, because they think Henry must be so ridiculously splendid if this is the guy who comes before him.
This just so to me it sounds like Henry wants to be the everyman's man in the court life. We wrote, like, obviously he wouldn't want to have been one of his own subjects, but a noble, like, everyman's man, out fighting, out conquering, getting dirty. That's all he wanted. That's what it's.
Yeah, he wants to go hunting. He wants to spend his time in pleasurable pursuits, but he knows there's business to be done as well. He controls so much land that there is inevitably going to be revolts all of the time. And most of his reign is the story of these little fires breaking out all across his territories and him having to run down there with a fire extinguisher and put them out. And that keeps him busy. And, he probably doesn't have as much time as he might like. And he's like, if I'm going to have some spare time, I'm going to spend it doing something I want to do, reading a book or going hunting. I'm not going to do it putting on some posh clothes to try and impress you. Yeah.
So, okay, 2 questions. If he's gone all this time, how did they have so many children? And the second part of that is, what was Eleanor doing while he's off putting out these fires?
Yes, I mean, they do have a lot of children. And it is interesting because their relationship never seems to have been one that relied on them spending an awful lot of time together. There are cases of monarchs that you see spending as much time as they possibly can with their spouses, and they're rarely apart. Henry and Eleanor seem perfectly happy to be off doing their own things. Obviously, they come together every once in a while. Maybe every time there's a Christmas court, 9 months later there's a baby. So they are, incredibly good at having children when they're spending time together, but they also control so much territory that it needs so much focus. Henry installs his mom, Empress Matilda, in Normandy. She runs Normandy for him for the rest of her life, really. And he needs Eleanor to be doing that kind of thing for him in different places. So there are times when he leaves her in charge of Anjou. There are times when he makes her regent of England, effectively, when he leaves England. She's left in charge of England. Not a man, not one of the men at his court. Eleanor is looking after England for him. So this is a man with sprawling territories, largely controlled by the women in his life.
Yeah.
And she does very, very well at controlling those territories. Interestingly, a little bit later, the wheels kind of come off when Eleanor is allowed to go and control Aquitaine, which is a moment sort of later in their marriage, after they've finished having children, towards the end of the 1160s into the 1170s. It's often portrayed as a moment when Henry decides he's had enough of Eleanor. He packs her off to Aquitaine. I think that's a misreading of the situation and of their relationship. Eleanor has always been obsessed with Aquitaine and the future of Aquitaine. And she that's her home. It's where she's always wanted to go back to. I think this moment is Henry recognizing her contribution to what they've achieved together and saying, I know you want to go back to Aquitaine, so go have Aquitaine, go and rule it. Yes, Henry's still technically Duke because that's how everything works during this period. So she's sent there with Richard. Richard is going to be the next Duke of Aquitaine. He's invested as Duke of Aquitaine, and Eleanor is allowed to go and rule Aquitaine and take Richard to train him how to be the next Duke of Aquitaine, to train the next custodian of her family's area. And I don't think this is Henry pushing Eleanor away. I think this is Henry saying thank you. I think it's him giving her everything that she wants. Unfortunately for Eleanor, it's also the moment when she really struggles. She can't control Aquitaine. It's always a rebellious place. And as impressive as Eleanor is, she can't control Aquitaine. And so I think by the time we get into the early 1170s, she's maybe looking for a way out of the situation that she's in. And I think she finds one, and I don't think it's necessarily the one that people always think she finds.
Oh, I want to know more about that, but help me understand the timeline, because obviously this is outside of my tutor scope. I mean, I know some medieval, but I do not have dates memorized or anything. She gets sent to Aquitaine to rule Aquitaine. What year is that in conjunction with the Thomas Becket murder?
So Thomas Becket is murdered in 1170, and it's sort of just after that, so early 1170. Okay. She's been getting more and more involved in Aquitaine, but she goes there to live permanently, kind of thing. Okay. Just after Thomas Becket's murder.
Okay, so before we go back to how Eleanor succeeded, let's go back to Thomas Becket, because of course everybody wants to talk about that. It's such an interesting piece of Henry II's history. I also want to understand Eleanor's involvement in all of that. Where do we see her fit in? I mean, if you want to tell the story about how it all played out in case people are listening and they don't know, and then kind of bring Eleanor into it too.
Yeah, sure. So this is Thomas, splendid Thomas, who has been doing a great job of being the impressive arm of Henry's government. He comes from fairly humble beginnings. He entered the service of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who, when almost as soon as Henry II became king in 1154, excuse me, almost as soon as Henry became king in 1154, the Archbishop of Canterbury kind of recommends Thomas to Henry, pushes him into his household, tells him that this guy's really good. Undoubtedly, he's there as a little bit of a spy for the Archbishop of Canterbury as well, to report back what's going on. Yeah. Thomas proves himself utterly impressive, becomes invaluable to Henry, running the chancery, which is the arm of the king's court at this point that is responsible for writing letters, writing all of the proclamations that go out, all of that kind of stuff. So it's a writing office, really. Thomas oversees this, gets closer and closer to Henry. Henry clearly likes him. They, as much as a king and his subject can ever be friends, they do appear to be best mates. Yes, I think Henry absolutely infuriates Thomas. And we get these little windows into their relationship. So there's one story that's recorded in a chronicle And it talks about, Henry and Thomas are out riding. There's some, the guards are behind them. They're just riding and chatting, and it's freezing cold. So they're wearing their big, heavy cloaks. And Thomas is wearing, surprise, surprise, a lovely, luxurious, brand new cloak that he's just bought. And Henry spots an old man at the side of the road who is rags for clothes, looks like he's starving. He's absolutely freezing, shivering at the side of the road. And Henry says to Thomas, would it be an act of charity to give this man a cape? And Thomas was like, yes, of course it would, sire. And Henry says, go on then, and pulls at Thomas's cloak. But Thomas's cloak is fastened around his throat by a clasp. So Henry is yanking on this cloak, thinking this is hilarious, trying to get this cloak off Thomas, while Thomas is going... to the point where those guards that are riding a bit behind them come charging over because they think someone's attacked the king or something. They think there's a fight going on. And Henry's like, no, it's fine. I'm just stealing Thomas's cloak to give it to this old guy. The guards think this is hilarious. This is the splendid Thomas being made a bit of a fool of by the king.
Yeah.
And eventually Thomas manages to undo this clasp and Henry gives the cloak to the old man. And they all ride off, probably with Thomas now starting to shiver. All of these guards kind of laughing at him and poking fun at him. And it's like, oh, do you want to borrow one of our cloaks, do you?
Oh, gosh.
So you see these moments that they're kind of like, a bit of laddish fun, maybe, but there is always this edge to them that don't forget that Henry's in charge.
Yeah.
You couldn't do that to Henry, but he can do that to you anytime he wants to. So their relationship is interesting and weird because I think they're very close to being friends, but Henry is still a king.
Yeah.
And that is a sharp edge that is always there in their relationship.
Even though he doesn't want to really be the king, he is still the king and he's showing his power and in a sense almost humiliating him.
Yeah. So the dangerous thing about allowing Thomas to do what he allows Thomas to do is that Thomas could get carried away with that. And I wonder how much Henry is trying to keep reminding Thomas, keep bringing him down to earth and keep reminding him, you're only doing all this splendid stuff for me. It's not on your behalf, it's for me. And so eventually Henry, there is lots of trouble in Europe, across Europe, about the church's role in states at this time. So there's a long period called the investiture crisis, which is all about who should appoint a bishop. Kings and rulers in countries say that they should, it's their job. The Pope says, no, it's mine. And you get these kind of few decades in which there is a lot of strife and trouble about all of this. And England is affected by this as lots of other places. Henry wants to gain control over the church in England and particularly over appointments to bishoprics and archbishoprics and stuff. It can be lucrative and it can also make sure that you get your people in positions of power.
Yeah. And
so Henry, sees ways traditionally in Normandy, the Duke has always had much more control over the church. So he's finds he's quite able to enforce his will there and look back to proclamations from the time of William the Conqueror and call on those and use those. But there's nothing very similar in England. So when the Archbishop of Canterbury dies, he hits on this idea in 1162 to make Thomas Archbishop. What could possibly go wrong, right? Sounds like a great idea. This guy can do anything and everything I want and need him to do. He's the most useful servant I have. He's running the government for me. What if I put him in charge of the church as well? He's such a good guy. He'll give me whatever I want. So Thomas is called to Henry on the continent. And again, some of the chronicles paint this lovely scene of Henry kind of putting his arm around Thomas. And he's like, Thomas, I've got some great news for you. You're never going to guess. You're never going to guess. And Thomas is like, oh, what now? And Henry says, you're going to be the next Archbishop of Canterbury. And Thomas is like, oh, no. I don't want that. Absolutely not. I'm not even a priest. How am I going to be Archbishop of Canterbury? That's never going to work. And Henry, and I think this is, again, one of those moments where you see that relationship. Henry's mood changes a little and he's like, no, Thomas, you're going to be the next Archbishop of Canterbury. It's interesting, but Thomas is a man in his 30s at this point. He's not married. He's got no children. And I think he would see very clearly that not only does becoming Archbishop of Canterbury mean he can never have that life, he can never get married and have children if he wanted to, but also Henry is putting him in that position of power so that he can hand all of the power of that position to Henry.
Yeah.
And leave himself, strip himself of everything that he's got. And And it also means resigning his position as Lord Chancellor, which is where he's getting, the Archbishop of Canterbury is rich. Thomas is getting very, very wealthy from being Lord Chancellor already and has the freedom to do whatever he likes with that money and with the rest of his life. So Thomas does his best to protest, and I think genuinely to say, this is a silly idea, Henry. And Henry's like, oh, no, I don't have silly ideas. I have brilliant ideas that definitely are going to happen. And we get this situation where, technically the monks of Canterbury are allowed to elect the Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry says, wouldn't it be great if you elected Thomas? Wouldn't it be great? You're going to elect Thomas, right? And the monks are like, oh, we're not very sure. And Henry's like, tell you what, come to London and see me, and we'll see whether you're going to elect Thomas. And Henry ends up shut in this room with the monks for quite a while, and Thomas is outside, and the chronicler saying you can hear the raised voices. And all of a sudden, Thomas is called in, and Henry says, great news, the monks have elected you the next Archbishop of Canterbury. Wow, what a surprise.
Meanwhile, the monks are sitting there with tape over their mouth.
Exactly that, with probably welt marks on the sides of their faces and everything else.
Yeah.
Cowering in the corners. Going, hi, Thomas. Great to have you.
Hey, buddy.
And I think you can imagine Thomas, again, with his head in his hand going,
yeah,
this is not good. So he resigns the chancellorship. Henry issues him with a pardon for any offence that he may have committed during his time in public service. And he's invested as a priest, and the same day he's made Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry is absolutely rubbing his hands together. This is fantastic. This is going to be absolutely amazing. I'm going to get everything I want. And the first sign of a problem is that Henry has this meeting in which he tries to change the rules affecting sheriffs, effectively so that sheriffs in all the counties would have to give more money to the crown than they're already giving. And the only dissenting voice against this, all of the sheriffs know better than to speak against Henry. It's like, oh, okay, Henry, I suppose that's great. Well done, you. The only dissenting voice is Thomas. And this is nothing to do with the Archbishop of Canterbury. This is secular politics and government finance. But Thomas stands up and goes, you got no right to do that, Henry. And I think you can imagine Henry going, what?
How dare you?
What are you doing?
Yeah.
What are you doing? But, I guess maybe he thinks Thomas is just, making this protest so that when he hands over all the powers of the church, it looks like, he's not just Henry's guy. And Henry comes up with this document called the Constitutions of Clarendon, which essentially hands over control of the church to Henry. It prevents appeals outside of England to Rome without the permission of the king. It allows the king to appoint people to church offices. It allows the king to try ecclesiastics. They're saying people are literally getting away with murder because they're priests and they can't be tried by the secular courts. The church claims jurisdiction over them, but is so ridiculously lenient that it's bad for law and order. And all of the gathered bishops must have held their breath and I knew it. I knew this is what they were doing. And their faces must have dropped when Thomas accepts that document from Henry, holds it in his hand and reads it. And all the bishops must have been thinking, that's it, we're done.
Yeah.
And Thomas says, this is absolutely unacceptable. You can't have this. And I think if Henry pulled a face at that thing with the sheriffs, I think he explodes at this point. He absolutely loses his temper. He's absolutely furious with Thomas. Because the trouble is, Thomas is now in a position where it's very difficult for Henry to do anything about what he's doing. And there's this whole idea that, Thomas has this Damascene conversion and suddenly becomes committed to the powers of the church. I don't know that it's necessarily that. I wonder whether Thomas is someone who is so utterly committed to whatever task that he's doing that he's brilliant at it. You make him Chancellor of England and he'll be the best Chancellor you've ever had. You tell him to go and be your public face and do all of the display that you don't want to do, and he'll do it better than anybody else, to the point where the French think you must be top tier because he's making such a good impression on them. But you make him Archbishop of Canterbury, in which he's responsible for maintaining and protecting the powers of the church and the independence of the church, and you better believe he's going to do it. So I don't know that it's necessarily some say this Damascene conversion that is often portrayed, more than the fact that Henry gave him a job and Thomas is doing the job that he's been given. It's not the job that Henry now wants,
right?
But it is the job he was given. Henry flies into an absolute rage. Kind of by 1164, this is the wheels are coming off this, and Henry summons Thomas to Northampton to come before him. And Thomas, ever the showman, Thomas turns up. Henry summons him to stand before him as a secular lord. Henry's saying you embezzled money and all of this sort of stuff while you were Lord Chancellor, so you're coming before me as a secular figure. So Thomas turns up in his archbishop's robes, the finest ones you can find, and he walks into the place carrying a cross in front of him.
Oh gosh!
I mean, there's nothing like poking the bear, and if you're going to do it, let's use a great big cross to poke the bear.
Yes.
And all of the bishops, well, some of the bishops are backing Henry, but some of the bishops that are closer to Henry, most of the bishops are backing Thomas, but some of the bishops that are closer to Henry are like, you're just going to really, really annoy him.
Yeah.
This is not going to be great. Just stop it. And they're saying, you want to put down your cross, otherwise you're likely to feel the sharp edge of Henry's sword of justice kind of thing. Yeah. And Thomas replies to them that if Henry's sword is able to smite the body, mine smites the soul and sends them straight to hell.
Ooh. And
it's kind of like anything he's got, I've now got better.
Yeah,
he might be able to kill a body, I can kill his soul and send him to hell. And you can imagine the bishops being, oh no, we're in for one of those days again.
Yeah.
So Thomas is summoned in before Henry. Henry says, you embezzled all this money, you've behaved badly in public office, you're in trouble. And Thomas says, oh, but you gave me a pardon for everything that I'd done in public service. Do you remember that? And Henry is immediately like, oh, my God, I do remember that. Yes, thank you for reminding me. Absolutely fuming. Kind of kicks Thomas out and tells him to go away. Thomas has to go and stay in a local monastery because his lodgings in the town have been filled up with Henry's men. This is very clearly Henry saying, you're in trouble. You can't even stay where you want to stay in town. Thomas then takes to his bed and says he's ill. Henry calls him back the next day. Thomas sends back word, I can't come, I'm too ill. Thomas sends a couple of earls over and they seem convinced that Thomas really is genuinely too ill to come. And so eventually when he recovers, Henry calls him in again. They have another kind of almost a confrontation, but it's more with the bishops actually outside the room this time. And Thomas ends up fleeing from Northampton. Henry orders the gates of the town locked. Thomas manages to get the keys off one of the porters at the gates, presumably by threatening to send him straight to hell.
Right. Yeah, he has that power.
Keys. That'd probably work. But he manages to flee out of Northampton, gets to the coast and gets across to France and heads off into exile for several years. He becomes a huge embarrassment to Henry, a huge thorn in Henry's side. The King of France, Louis, absolutely loving it. Absolutely loving it. The Pope is based in France at this point because there's a problem in Rome. Henry sends word to the Pope. Well, he sends word when Thomas gets to Louis's court, he finds a couple of English earls there who have arrived to ask Louis to kick Thomas out. And you kind of get this scene where Louis kind of pushes them aside and goes, Thomas, it's great to see you. Welcome. Come on in. Can't believe what Henry's done to you. This is outrageous.
Oh my gosh.
Henry tries to send word to the Pope not to welcome Thomas, not to hear what he's got to say. And the Pope says, hello, Thomas. Great to see you. Welcome. No. Come and tell me everything. Thomas takes a copy of those constitutions of Clarendon, and the Pope and all of the cardinals agree that he was absolutely right not to agree to all of this. So he's got papal backing. He's got the King of France on his side. And Louis undoubtedly is absolutely loving the chance to get one over on Henry. Every time there are any kind of peace negotiations between England and France, we get to the point where they've almost agreed everything. Final meeting, we're just going to put seals on things now. And Thomas turns up. And his mere presence seems to irritate Henry so much that everything goes out the window. So he's now becoming a blockage on peace between England and France. And eventually, after a few years, he even becomes a bit of an irritation to Louis because Louis now wants peace as well. And Thomas is still just getting in the way. Every time they're about to agree anything, Thomas turns up and goes, hi, remember me? And so we get this situation in 1170 when Henry has his son, Henry the Young King, crowned as King of England. And he allows the Archbishop of York to do it, which is an outrage to the Archbishop of Canterbury. There is a big rivalry at this point still between Canterbury and York for who is the senior archbishop in England. So this outrages Thomas. Henry has also not included Henry the Young King's wife in that coronation, who is Louis, the King of France's daughter. And I think that's deliberate. I think what him and Louis have actually managed to get their heads together and come up with a plan here. Because Thomas, throws his toys out the pram in a fit of pique. And Henry says, well, I'll tell you what, come back to England. Let's find some peace. Let's settle this agreement between us. And you can redo the coronation and we'll include Margaret. Because Louis sat in France and gone, oh, you missed my daughter out. That's a bit naughty. So they reach this agreement. This peace is agreed between them. Henry then goes a bit further south into France after they've agreed this and says he's too ill to go back to England. I wonder whether he's trying to stay out of the way and just not cause any friction.
Yeah.
When Thomas is heading back to England, sails back to England, and he hears that all of the bishops are gathering on the south coast to greet him and to welcome him back home. And so he orders the ship to land somewhere else away from them. What are you doing? He heads straight to Canterbury and kind of, locks himself up in there and excommunicates every bishop that's worked with Henry in England, excommunicates everyone that was involved in Henry the Young King's first coronation. I mean, this is absolutely not the reconciliation that he has just agreed to. Thomas is now throwing everything back in Henry's face. And so this is where we get that Christmas court in 1170 at Burle-Roi, where Henry reportedly says something that is taken by three of the knights there to be an instruction to go and kill Thomas Becket. They arrive at Canterbury, try to arrest him. I am fairly convinced that at this point Thomas has resigned himself to martyrdom, and that he kind of orchestrates this situation. The accounts that we have from, there's monks who were present there who write chronicles of the events afterwards, and they describe a scene that is so reminiscent of the last days of Christ. It mimics the Garden of Gethsemane. He says to the knights, if you've come for me, don't hurt anybody else here. He's very clearly mimicking all of that. They try to drag him out of the cathedral, and Thomas holds onto a post. He's in his 50s by this point, and he's holding onto this post so tight that three knights can't pull him away. He's obviously still quite a physically capable guy, because he's so determined that if they're going to kill him, they have to do it in a cathedral. Because what does that probably mean? Probably means martyrdom, probably means sainthood, probably means eternal victory for Thomas.
Yes.
Yes, you die, but you're going to get that final victory over Henry that you'll never be able to get over a king in life.
Yes.
And so I think he orchestrates that moment in which he is executed. There are the accounts also talk about him goading at least one of the knights. He's having a bit of a go at him, and it sort of cranks up the tension until eventually they attack him, end up killing him on the floor of Canterbury Cathedral. This obviously causes immense outrage in the whole of Europe. And this is where we kind of start to see Eleanor popping up a little bit. It's hard to see her involved anywhere in this. Actually, we can see Empress Matilda involved very early, because when she was married to the Holy Roman Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor appointed his best mate as an archbishop in the hope that it would work out really well, and it all went horribly wrong. And Empress Matilda writes a letter to Henry and says, don't make the same mistake that I've seen made before. Don't appoint Thomas as Archbishop of Canterbury. And Henry says, shut up, Mom. I do what I want.
Yeah, exactly.
So we get all this diplomatic frenzy in which the King of France is saying, look what Henry has done in England. This is ridiculous. The man needs to be excommunicated, deposed. Isn't it awful? I could probably just take care of his lands in France if you'd like me to. Don't worry about that.
You could probably take those off your hands if you need to.
Don't worry about that. He's encouraging the Pope to excommunicate Henry. There are letters that the Pope is sending letters of excommunication and things to England. And at one point we see Eleanor intercept one of those messengers who is bringing the letters of excommunication. So the Pope tries to forbid the coronation of Henry the Young King from happening again with his wife. Henry really wants that to happen, and the Pope sends letters forbidding any of the English clergy to preside over that coronation. And Eleanor intercepts that messenger in the north of France and stops him crossing the Channel, so that blockage on the coronation of Henry the Young King can't reach England. So she's very clearly playing a very active part in helping her husband at this point. Henry goes off to Ireland in the immediate aftermath of it, in no small part, I think, to get himself out of the way a little bit, but also he goes over to Ireland and says, look, these are the wrong kind of Christians over here. They've never been under the Roman Church. They're still Celtic Christians. Wouldn't it be great if I brought them, under the Roman Church and made them all Roman Catholic Christians instead? And he manages to do that. And so the Pope, by the time he gets back, the Pope is like, okay, that is pretty cool. Well, good on you. And they have this, this investigation in which Henry gives testimony and swears an oath on relics that he never meant for Thomas Becket to be killed, that whatever he said, that was never his intention. Is he willing to perjure himself? I don't know. But he needs to get himself out of trouble, that much is certain. And so the investigation finds that Henry's telling the truth. He didn't really mean it. The Pope absolves him of any involvement. And Louis must have been absolutely furious. Again, Louis thinks he's got one over on Henry, and Henry pulls the cat out the bag. He's some kind of political magician. How he turns this in his favour, I don't know. And then, a few years later, when there's a big rebellion involving their sons, the King of Scotland is also invaded from the south again, because he's King of Scotland. Why wouldn't you?
What else do you have to do, right?
Henry, in the midst of all of this trouble, Henry crosses the Channel, gets to Canterbury, gets within sight of Canterbury Cathedral, a fair distance away still, gets off his horse, takes off his shoes and walks barefoot to Canterbury Cathedral. He goes and prays at Thomas Becket's shrine, which has grown up really, really quickly. There is a cult of Thomas almost instantly on his death. He goes and prays at Thomas's shrine, and he asks the monks of Canterbury to whip him. He lies on the floor on his stomach and asks them to whip him with birch sticks. And again, I can imagine this picture of the monks going, I'd rather not. I don't want to hit the king.
Yeah, exactly.
You might be asking for it now, but if you decide tomorrow you didn't want it to happen, I don't want to do it. And he kind of has to order them to whip him. It's becoming a really weird scene, Henry.
Yeah.
So each of the monks of Canterbury gets to give one lash to the king as he lies there on the floor. And then he spends the entire night awake praying at Thomas's shrine after that. He gets up the next morning, gets to London, and news arrives as he gets to London that the King of Scotland's been captured. And everyone tries to do the maths about when it happened. And whether it's true or not, the maths arrives at the fact that the King of Scotland was captured exactly when Henry was praying at Thomas Becket's tomb.
Convenient.
What a coincidence.
Yeah.
And Henry is behind this, because he takes the initiative on this, and he's like, Thomas has forgiven me. Saint Thomas is on my side.
Oh my gosh.
And so I think the frustrating thing for Thomas up in heaven with his saint's halo on, looking down on this, is that he's got that final victory over Henry. He's a saint, and Henry's gone and turned the tables on him now, because now he's a saint who's on Henry's side.
Yes, so that worked out.
And you can imagine Thomas sitting there in heaven going, "Oh, he's done it again."
Oh, what can I do now? That story never gets old to me, and of course you do such a great job telling the story too. And we have to get back to Eleanor, and I know we're probably running a little bit low on time, but I want the story to be finished, so I'm willing to go a little bit long. But I've always wanted to know, and is there any evidence at all that you feel like maybe Eleanor was behind Henry's penance? Did she whisper in his ear, write him a letter, and be like, "This might not be a bad idea"?
Yeah, I mean, this is a moment, so it's hard to know whether that would have happened, because this is a moment when their sons are rebelling against them, and Eleanor will get kind of accused of being wrapped up in that, or perhaps even instigating the rebellion of their sons. Yeah, there is a story that she, flees from Poitiers, gets on a horse and rides to Paris to Louis. I simply cannot imagine Eleanor going to her ex-husband to try and fight against her current husband when Louis is such a wet fish and she knows it, and Henry is undefeatable and she knows it. Yeah. I don't see her picking that side in that fight. It would be stupid, and Eleanor is not stupid. I have a feeling that that what may have happened, and this is just my theory, this is just my reading of the events. Their sons rebel. So 3 of their sons, adult sons, rebel. The only reason John doesn't is because he's not old enough. Otherwise, he definitely would, because John's that kind of person. So 1173, they rebel against their father, claiming that he's not giving them enough power and all of that kind of thing. We maybe another day we'll get into the ins and outs of all of that, whether that's right or wrong. They are very quickly beaten by their father. It looks threatening for a while, but I don't think Henry is ever in any doubt that he can beat his sons. He's such an incredibly impressive man. And he does. He beats them. They are, forced into submission. Any of the Earls of England and the Barons of Normandy who've joined them are arrested. And Eleanor comes back to England as well, nominally at least, as a prisoner of her husband, Henry, for her involvement in this plot. Every single person that's involved is immediately released and forgiven. They're all reconciled. The only person who is not released is Eleanor. And the story goes that she's kept as a prisoner for the rest of Henry's reign. But I think there is room to think that perhaps she was involved in this idea of the penance and stuff, because I am utterly unconvinced that they fell out at this point. I don't think they weren't working together anymore. I don't think Eleanor joined in her son's rebellion, because I think she would have known it was going to fail. It was a stupid idea and it was going to fail.
Right.
I suspect that what might have happened is that Eleanor, who has been a victim of gossip and misogyny all of her life, this idea that she had an affair with her uncle in the Holy Land, that she planned to run away with Saladin. Saladin is 10 when she's in the Holy Land, but yeah, sure, she's going to run away with him and marry him and become a Muslim because she's just a terrible, terrible woman. There's accusations she had an affair with Henry's father before she was married to Henry. All sorts of stuff is thrown at her. Oh. She's the reason that the King of France couldn't have a son. Clearly she's not.
Yeah.
I think in 1173, I wonder, did they use all of that? Because what Louis is doing by this point, Louis has identified Henry and Eleanor as this huge threat. The way that he is countering that is trying to get into the ears of their sons and to turn them against their father. And the rest of Louis's reign, his son's reign, and the next generation after Henry is the story of the French kings trying to break all of that apart. I think Henry and almost certainly Eleanor must have seen the game that Louis was playing. Their sons are just too stupid to see that they're being used by Louis. I don't think Henry and Eleanor are stupid enough not to see it. What Henry can't have then is his sons being disaffected for too long. He can't arrest his sons and keep them in prison and allow this rift to develop. He needs to be able to forgive his sons and everyone else involved really quickly. But how do you do that without appearing weak?
Yeah.
Let's blame a woman.
Of course.
Because everybody is happy to believe, but everybody's happy to believe that a woman would be behind something like that, particularly a woman like Eleanor, who they believe is behind so much else that's gone on. I wonder whether Henry and Eleanor work together to use that prejudice to position Eleanor as the kind of the instigator, the big mover behind the scenes, so that they can forgive their sons and Eleanor can take all of the blame and everyone will go, yep, it's definitely a woman. It's always the woman.
Yeah.
Because what I mentioned before is also going on. Eleanor is failing in Aquitaine. And that's pretty embarrassing for a woman whose only concern is to rule Aquitaine. How does she extricate herself from that situation? Take the blame for this rebellion and retire to England. So, yes, she's termed as a prisoner by most people for the rest of Henry's reign, but I think maybe she just goes into a nice quiet retirement. We know she stays at her favourite castle in England at Devizes. Sorry, at Old Sarum, not Devizes. She stays at Old Sarum Castle, her favourite castle. Henry gives her bucket loads of money to live off. She has ridiculous amounts of clothes, the best of everything, servants everywhere. She is still at family events, so Christmas courts, Easter courts, when ambassadors come. Eleanor is still at court. She's not a prisoner. She's still seeing her children. If you believe she's instigated a rebellion by her sons, why are you allowing her to see her sons again if she's a prisoner?
Yeah.
When their oldest son, Henry the Young King, passes away, again, he's in open rebellion by this point. Henry allows Eleanor to go over to Rouen to visit his tomb. It's not someone he's being mean to. It's not someone he's treating as a prisoner. And when Henry dies in 1154, sorry, not in 1154, in 1189, he becomes king in 1154. That would have been a really short story. Everyone wishes it was a short story now.
No.
When Henry dies in 1189, Richard becomes king, and Richard has kind of chased his dad into the grave. at this point. He's literally chasing him across France when Henry dies. And Henry sends William Marshall, the famous Sir William Marshall, over to England to free Eleanor, tell her what's happened, tell her Richard is now king, and set her free. And the life of William Marshall that's written says William Marshall gets to Eleanor and finds that she's not in prison. She's free. She's wandering around. And he says, oh, Henry's died and Richard's king now. And Eleanor says, I know. She says she's perfectly well aware of what's happened. Thank you very much. So I wonder whether she was ever really a prisoner, or whether she was gaming the system in the way that the system has always tried to gain her. I think perhaps her and Henry never really had a breakdown in their relationship. I think perhaps this idea that she was a prisoner was the ultimate them working together to try and defeat Louis. You know, in the long run, it wouldn't work because their sons are idiots. But that doesn't mean that they weren't still actually incredibly close.
It sounds like she took a bullet for Henry in order to salvage their potential dynasty, maybe.
Yeah, I mean that is my reading of it. That's my theory, that she, whether it's her idea, whether it's Henry's idea, whether it's them working together, it gets her out of Aquitaine without having to admit that she's failed there. It allows their sons to be forgiven because their mum can take the blame for what's happened. And the idea would have been to stop Louis continuing to drive that wedge between them and their sons, to defeat Louis before he can win at his game. Unfortunately, like I say, in the long run, it doesn't work because, their sons are such idiots that even this doesn't save them. But, I think you can interpret those events as the ultimate sign of how close they were, that they play this little charade, and actually what's happening is everyone's getting what they want.
Yeah. Matt, I honestly could sit and listen to you for hours talking about this. I love the way you tell a story. You make it fun and funny, and you just never know where you're going to go. So thank you so much for this today. I always feel like I forget, but I want to give you an opportunity to pitch everything that you're doing. This is your opportunity to plug your work, your books, your podcast, your movie, everything.
Yeah. If anyone's still listening, I mean, if I bored everyone to death, I don't know. Sorry if your listenership has dropped off.
It hasn't. It has.
Yeah, no, it's very kind. Thank you. I co-host Gone Medieval podcast. I do episodes every Friday. Brilliant Eleanor Yarniger does episodes every Monday. I also host the Echoes of History podcast, which is attached to the Assassin's Creed game franchise. So it's kind of the real history behind Assassin's Creed. You don't have to be a gamer to listen to it. It's really just history. And I love it because I get to talk about, learn about bits of history that aren't just medieval. So stuff that I don't normally get to learn about and talk about. I have written several books. I don't know, mostly Wars of the Roses stuff, lots of Richard III, Princes in the Tower, biography of a kind of joint biography of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, biography of Henry III, their grandson, and then
the Anarchy,
Wars of the Roses, the Anarchy, Stephen and Matilda's Civil War, the Anarchy. So yeah, I have a Substack which I've been neglecting recently because I've just been busy, and that's naughty. I need to get back to writing stuff on my Substack. And yeah, we had, as we're talking now, last night was the premiere of A Taste of Loyalty, which is a short film that Thomas, Dennis and I and a fantastic cast and crew have made a short film, 17 minutes long, a proof of concept for a full-length feature film that we'd like to make about the life of Richard III. So A Taste of Loyalty tells the story of the Battle of Barnet and the aftermath of that.
It's so exciting. You're so busy. I feel so honored that you can take the time to spend an hour or so with me the last few weeks.
Always got time for you.
I used to always call you my brother from another mother. I still feel that way. We're both redheads. I think you're hilarious. Hopefully people think I'm funny.
You are. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad people think I'm funny. I just say silly things. People listen.
Like I said, I love the way that you tell a story because it makes it human. It makes it relatable to us in the 21st century. Some of the sarcastic remarks that you make makes it relatable to us. We can go, oh, yeah, that was dumb. Why did they do that? But well, I look forward to having you on again because I think we need to continue this story. I would love if we could talk next, maybe just about the sons and the children. I don't know anything about Richard the Lionheart. Zero. Zip. So that would be interesting to me.
Well,
but
now you know he's an idiot. I've said it enough times. He's an idiot. He's one of the idiots.
That's what I'll title that episode. Richard the Idiot.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, thank you again so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/tudorsdynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. Join the conversation with Rebecca on social media at Tudors Dynasty. Until next time.